Hello and welcome to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast, a podcast where we discuss all things relating to your well-being, including interviews with experts in the fields of nutrition, physical and mental health, and my 5-minute food facts series. I'm Amanda Hayes, your host, a nutritionist with a passion for well-being. Before I introduce today's guests, I will take a moment to let you know that you can subscribe to my podcast on YouTube, hit the red subscribe button, or on your favourite podcast app, iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. I'll also mention that, although I will often be speaking with experts, any information or advice provided in Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast is not intended to be used to treat, cure, or prevent injuries, disease, or medical conditions, and is not a substitute for advice from your own health professionals. Today I am here with Adrian Barei, physiotherapist and bike fit expert. As we will hear, Adrian has represented Australia in pole vault and is now a super keen cyclist. Adrian will be sharing his insights into cycling injuries and prevention and the benefits of a professional bike fit. I hope you enjoy the chat. Today I'm here with Adrian Barei. Adrian, thank you for coming on to my podcast.
Thanks, Amanda. Great to be here.
So Adrian, let's start with your sporting career. Adrian, I know that you were a pole vaulter, and I understand that you were introduced to pole vault at high school, and then you trained and competed in that sport for 13 years. So before we chat a little bit about pole vault, can you please explain to our listeners what it is?
It's a pretty exotic sport, one of the track and field events. So basically you've got a long run up, 40-45 metres is pretty typical for a senior vaulter. You've got a fiberglass or a carbon pole in your hand. You run down the runway, you plant the pole and you launch yourself into the air, hopefully clear a bar and hopefully land on something soft.
Where you plant the pole, is there a specific spot or a groove or something you have to get it in?
Yes, you'll be pleased to know that is called a box.
A box, okay, good to know.
It's a big metal box in the ground. It's kind of on a slope.
Okay, so how big is that box, just so I can picture this?
It's about 20-25 centimetres deep at the end. The slide is about 1 metre long and it's quite wide to start with and it narrows down. So where the tip of the pole actually ends up is a fairly sort of small, discrete end space.
So you have to be pretty precise, in other words, in terms of your run up and planting the pole.
Well, you know, when you stand in the runway 50 metres away, it looks like it's a tiny little space you've got to get the tip of the pole into. But as you get sort of more accustomed to the event, very rarely would you ever see anyone miss the box. Juniors starting out sometimes do, but when those sort of motor patterns become well developed, it's easy. Okay.
How long is the pole that you're carrying?
Again, when you start as a junior, it's going to be fairly short. They're all made in America, so I only remember the imperial measurements, but 12, 13 foot poles are what the kids are using when they start. And I think the longest pole that I would have used at the end of my career would have been 16 foot. Right. 16 foot 4, 16 foot 5. I think that's about 5 metres.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Is it heavy? I assume it's not that heavy.
They're heavy-ish. I mean, you've got to be well conditioned to be able to run 45 metres with this thing at full speed. But they're reasonably heavy.
Yeah, as you say, it is a pretty exotic sport. So what are the specific skills then that you need for pole vault?
Well, you've got to be able to run fast. If you can't sprint well, then you're not going to get anywhere. You have to be able to jump. So the first part of the event is basically a long jump. And then once you are in the air, you're essentially a gymnast. So you've got to employ a fair bit of upper body and core strength to get yourself upside down. And then to be in the right position over the bar and to be aware of where the bar is so you clear it and don't knock it off.
Right. Well, it sounds absolutely terrifying to me, but anyway.
It's very exciting. It's a very...
I bet it is.
It's a very sort of motivating, fun activity. And, I started it not knowing where it was going to take me, and I really, really enjoyed it. Got to travel around the world.
And Adrian, you're tall. Does it help to be tall? Or?
No, being tall is actually a hindrance.
Okay.
I'm 6'4" or 193 in modern language, and that's probably on the very end of the spectrum in terms of pole vaulters' height.
Yeah.
Most of the better pole vaulters are probably 5'10", 6 foot, around that sort of mark.
Okay. I believe that you competed for Australia in your pole vaulting career. Can you tell us a bit about that and also what your career highlight was?
Yeah, I had 4 Australian jerseys or Guernseys. I think the first one was in 1990. I was selected as part of the World Junior Championships touring team that competed in the UK and ultimately in Bulgaria, and that was a bit of an eye-opener going to Bulgaria. We competed, or the team competed in a city called Plovdiv. And I can't
Is it
imagine
as exotic as it sounds? Plovdiv.
Yeah, Plovdiv. Yeah. Look, it certainly had its highlights, but as a 17-year-old, being in this, quite seemingly Eastern Bloc city, it was a bit of an eye-opener.
I bet. Yeah.
So that was the first Australian team that I made. Then I went away the following year to New Zealand, and then the final. I went to the US a long time ago. Went to the US for another underage trip, and then probably the highlight of my career was competing at the World University Games, which was in Fukuoka in Japan in 1995, and I jumped 5 meters 20. At that event, I think I came 13th or 14th, but that a lot of people wouldn't realise, but the World University Championships are actually a level above the Commonwealth Games.
Oh right,
and
I didn't know that.
Yeah, because it's a world. It attracts athletes from all around the world, and a lot of great athletes in their teens and 20s are at uni. So
yes,
it's certainly beyond the Commonwealth Games sort of level. Obviously not quite as high as Olympic or the normal World Championships, but there were some pretty amazing athletes at that event.
Oh, that would have been amazing. And what was your personal best? Yeah,
so in that competition I jumped 5:20. The personal best that I retired with was 5 meters 30, which is 17'4" in the old language.
Goodness, that's just hard to picture, I have to say. Well, I read that recently there was a world record that was set in February this year by Armand Duplantis. Mondo. So he jumped 6.17 meters in Poland. So what do you think about that? That sounds pretty impressive.
Yeah, so when I was growing up and pole vaulting, my hero was Sergei Bubka, and that's a name that was fairly well known in athletic circles around the 15, 20 years ago. And we watched this guy break world records month after month, year after year. And never thought that we'd see someone with quite his talent emerge, but again. But since then, we've seen Mondo Duplantis, who's got a very interesting background because his father, Greg Duplantis, was an American, very, very high-level pole vaulter, and I actually competed against him once or twice.
Oh, right.
He was at the end of his career, and I was at the start of my career on some of these international trips. And so Mondo's got an American father, Greg Duplantis. He's got a Swedish mum. Can't remember this lady's name, but he's elected to compete for Sweden, which was an interesting decision. But he now is, I think he's 20 years old, and he's already he actually has broken the world record twice in the last month.
That's extraordinary.
So he jumped the one that you just talked about in Poland, and a week later he broke the world record again by an extra centimetre. So
wow.
He is kicking goals at the moment.
Where do you think that the limit of human potential is with pole vault?
Yeah, so when Sergei was jumping, we as a pole vault community always believed that he had the ability to go higher than what he actually finished with. I think his final world record was 6:14 or 6:15, and we kind of figured he might have been able to jump 6:30.
Wow.
And if you have a look at some of the slow motion replays and still shots from Mondo's recent world records, and we look at hip height, how high you get your hips over the bar. If you stop some of that footage, you'll see he's got at least 15-20 centimeters of center of gravity height over the bar, so he could push the world record to 6 meters 30, 6:40.
That's unbelievable. What is it about him, do you think? Is it physiology, mindset? Oh, it's probably all of those.
Well, my understanding is that both his parents were elite level athletes,
Right.
so he's obviously got
Genes.
some good heredity there. But he's been pole vaulting. He's been pole vaulting since he could walk. There's plenty of videos of him, a bit like Tiger Woods, hitting golf balls since he was 3 or 4 years old. Mondo was jumping, when he could run. There was a little pole, and he'd run and jump into a sand pit, and jump into a little homemade foam pit in their backyard. So he's just grown up with it, and I guess they've found the right balance of having parents that can coach, that are providing, all the technical skills that he needs and the right motivation, but without pushing him too hard. And he's just found that sweet spot.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting because, most kids would not be exposed to pole vault, for one.
No.
And secondly, that he's, got the parents who encourage yet don't push too much. It sounds like he's got, the right balance going on there. So, Adrian, if we move on now to your professional career, you studied physiotherapy at university. You worked in several clinics and established your current clinic, Podium Physio, in 2018. And I believe you also undertook some postgraduate study, a Masters of Advanced Clinical Physiotherapy in Sport. So why did you decide to extend your studies and do the Masters?
I've toyed with the idea of going back to do further physio study several times over the course of my career. It's pretty common for physios to go back and do a master's fairly early on. I think, judging from my experience with the cohort that were in my class, most of them were in their early 20s.
Right.
So it seems like they work for a few years and then go back and do the further study. I guess I just came to the point where I realised, A, I'm probably halfway through my working career, and B, that after 20 years, I finished my undergraduate degree in 1994. Things have changed. Now we've physios moved on from being a fairly empirical field of health, where we've kind of back in the day we did things because that's how we've always done things, and now we've moved on very, very much to evidence-based medicine, and these days we need to follow what the research says and what the science says, and therefore you've got to know what the science says. So the master's degree through 2017 and 2018 was a real clarifying refresh of the knowledge, and I was amazed at how much things have moved on.
I guess also a good thing about waiting, for want of a better word, to that point in your career is you're probably quite focused on what kind of work you want to be doing, and in your case it was clearly sports focused.
Yeah, that's true. I've always had a background, personally in sport, from track and field, and now I'm doing a bit of cycling. My kids both play sport at reasonably high level at high school, and I'm just interested in sports. Sorry, what was the question?
Oh, no, I was just talking about you finding, when you studied the masters, you knew that you wanted to be involved in sports, and that's what you're drawn to,
that's
obviously.
Very true. I've actually spent about 10 years working in occupational health, which was never an area that I thought I was going to head towards, and I kind of landed there accidentally, but man, that gave me some interesting insights into how the work cover system operates, or in many cases doesn't operate particularly well. So that was an area of physio that was very interesting.
Yeah. how did you manage to fit your postgraduate study in with your life, with your job and other responsibilities that you have?
Yes, well, some people close to me would say that I didn't actually manage to fit it in.
It's pretty hard, I think.
The local postgraduate physio course is, I hope I'm not offending anyone at the uni by saying it's quite directed towards international students. So the way they construct it is, and the way that it's best done is full-time over an 11-month period. And basically you just head down, bottom up, go, working hard for that period of time. And the reality is, during that 11-month period, I didn't do a lot of work. I was only consulting on weekends for the majority of it. We were basically living on my wife's wage during that period of time, and I did not fit in a lot of other stuff. I wasn't doing much cycling.
Right.
There was a period of about 3 months where we were 40 hours a week contact hours at the uni, and that was 3 months that were really tough.
Wow, that's a massive commitment. I can understand why it might be easy to do that in your 20s.
Yeah, well, when you've got a business and you've got a family and you've got hobbies and you're trying to keep fit and you're trying to keep sane, that was a big challenge. But I did have a lot of support, and I got to thank my wife and family for being very supportive over that period of time. And I think in some ways it did bring out some real traits of strong focus, and I just had to be. I wouldn't have gotten through the course if I couldn't push this other these other distractions to the side.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's very much about prioritising and focus.
Has to be.
Yeah. And then tell us about Podium Physio. So you've set up your own practice, and so what drove you to do that, and how's that process been for you?
I think fairly simply, I had a work arrangement leading into when I was considering going back to uni that was fairly flexible, but I wanted to particularly explore doing more work with cyclists and getting into bike fitting, and there wasn't the space where I was working, and there wasn't the time in the diary where I was working, so I had the choice of either not using the skills in the way that I wanted to, or going to find somewhere else. And I could have taken a job elsewhere, some other sports clinic, but I guess I wanted to carve out a little niche for myself, and I do have a small practice that I can call my own. It's fairly central, so it's fairly accessible to people from all around Adelaide.
Yeah.
And I guess I've been self-employed for most of my working career, so this was an extension of that, just another iteration of my own business, and I've really enjoyed it. I mean, it's there's a lot of freedom, there's a lot of responsibility, but at the end of the day, being your own boss and setting your own schedule has a lot of advantages, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with a lot of local cyclists from very much beginner level to some quite experienced and quite advanced riders.
Yeah, well, this is a good place then to talk about cycling. So after you stopped thrusting yourself into the air over a pole, your main sport became cycling. So what is it about cycling? What drew you to cycling?
I retired as a pole vaulter at the age of 25, and there were quite a few years where I actually didn't do much physical activity at all. And I look back on those photos from those times, and I think, that's not quite the image I was hoping for. But yeah, I didn't ever plan to become a cyclist. I think I started riding. I bought an old bike, secondhand bike from a local bike store, and just started commuting to work because I knew that I'd let my fitness drop, and I was just looking at simple ways to reintroduce some activity into my life, and yeah, it just kind of really grew organically. So I went from commuting to I bought a flat bar hybrid bike and just started to venture up into the local Adelaide hills, and really enjoyed that challenge. And I think, I know that a really defining turning point for me in terms of switching on a bit of competitive edge was starting to watch the international cycling on Eurosport in 2015, and in particular watching the Giro d'Italia that year, which was kind of the first time I'd ever watched a cycling Grand Tour. And I was just blown away by the athleticism of these guys. And I was really inspired, partly because some of these guys were older, in their mid to late 30s, some of them even approaching 40. But I just really enjoyed watching these attacks and these courageous breakaways, these mountain stages. It was awesome.
Yeah, it is an amazing sport, isn't it? And there's a lot of tactics and things in there that until you actually start cycling, you don't really know about. Well, I certainly didn't, and
absolutely.
I still don't know a lot about it, but it is a lot more exciting to watch than you would imagine, isn't it?
Yeah, I never would have appreciated how much of a team sport it is, because you see one person at the end of the day standing on the podium, but there's 7, 8, 9 in the team that have got them into that position. And now that I've been watching cycling and being involved in cycling for 5 years, I've got a much better appreciation of how that all comes together.
Yeah, well, in terms of your own cycling, do you have a highlight or a memorable moment that you can tell us about? Something you're proud of achieving or enjoyed, or? Yeah,
look, I've competed. Competed is probably not the right word. I've participated in a lot of rides around South Australia and interstate. So I've done 3 of the L'Etape Australia rides, which have all been in the Snowy Mountain regions in New South Wales. I've done a lot of the Bupa Challenge rides, or that's the Westpac Challenge ride this year that are on during the Tour Down Under. But I'd have to say that I've got 2 cycling highlights so far, and they've both been overseas. So the first one was in 2017. My wife and I went to ride through Italy, and we had 3 days in the Dolomites, and that is truly God's country, the Dolomites.
How beautiful.
I would be back there in a heartbeat. It was just extraordinary. And the cycling there is just amazing, and it's a little bit different to cycling in and around Adelaide. I think the other traffic is a lot more courteous towards cyclists.
I guess they're just very used to them.
They're much more accepting of it. But we cycled up some amazing mountains. We did the Stelvio Pass on my wife's 40th birthday, which was just completely surreal. We had a bottle of Prosecco waiting for her at the top. We've got photos of her popping this cork at 2,700 metres in the air. I cycled up the Mortirolo and the Gavia Pass in one day towards the end of that ride, and that was 4,500 metres of climbing. And when I finished that ride, I had not one kilojoule of energy left in my body.
Amazing.
The only thing I had energy left to do was to drink the massive hot chocolate that was waiting for me in the Refugio at the top of the Gavia. But I was absolutely spent. I brought home a tiny little rock from the top of this Gavia climb, which just reminds me of what I achieved that day, and it sits on my windowsill. So whenever I'm having a tough day, I just look at that rock and think, no, it was never as hard. It's never as hard as what I did that day.
Oh, that's great inspiration to have that. Would you ever want to do that again, or is it one of those, I've completed that now? And
well, with Strava, you see your times, and you think about, I was a bit slow around that corner, or I stopped and waited and had a drink at that spot, and maybe if I hadn't stopped and had a drink at that spot. Look, I've cycled in Italy and I've cycled in Spain. I'd probably, the next obvious thing to do would be to go to France and tackle some of the big climbs there.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the great things about cycling as a sport. There are so many amazing places you can go.
Yeah, and not just through Europe. We've been watching some of the climbing in Colombia, and we've looked at some of the climbs in the US and Colorado. I think is a great place to cycle. Hawaii has got some amazing climbs. So there's lots of areas around the world.
And in terms of, you mentioned before the Tour Down Under, so we're pretty lucky here in Adelaide. Every January we have the Tour Down Under, which is part of the UCI World Tour, and there's a men and a women's tour, which is great, and it does attract some of the best names in international cycling. And this year, the men's winner was Richie Port, who's an Australian. It was his second time that he's won it. And the women's was Ruth Winder from the US. So when the Tour Down Under's here, they have community rides that you can be involved in. And I think you mentioned that. So have you, you've been involved in the Tour Down Under, have you?
I've done I think 5 of those community rides. I didn't actually ride this year, but I've done 5 in the past. I'm not officially involved in the tour because I've actually inquired in the past, but all of the teams arrive with their own soigneurs and massage people and such, and they tend to be fairly self-reliant. Actually, my wife has been the ambassador for one of the women's teams 3 years in a row, so it's been really lovely to get involved with the TIBCO Silicon Valley Bank team, TIBCO SVB. So we've got to know the team owner, Linda Jackson, very well, and we've seen the girls on the roster. They've come over for a barbecue at our place.
Oh, fantastic!
3 years in a row, and my wife in particular has been involved in helping chaperone, and my daughter helped to babysit the director sportif's young son this year. So we've tried to get involved and get amongst the women's race.
Yeah, that's great.
The women's event as much as the men's.
Yeah, and with the women when they're here, or the men, what do you have any feedback? What do they think of the course? What do they think of riding in South Australia?
Look, it's fairly well documented and well known that the international riders love coming to Adelaide because otherwise they'd be in the middle of winter in the Northern Hemisphere. One thing that's quite rare about this ride or this race is that they stay in one base for the entire period of time, so they don't have to go from hotel to hotel, and that's anyone who's travelled understands that packing and unpacking is just a major impediment to enjoying yourself. So these guys and girls can just sort of unpack and be in the one spot for a week or two. Some of the riders come out before Christmas, and particularly the Australian based ones, they're out here prepping from late December onwards, but they just love being in the one place. They love seeing all of the scenery, and it's good to see also they get involved in some of the community issues. Like there was at least a few of the teams that went out to some of the areas that were hit by the bushfires and did community events, visited schools and stuff like that. Just did a bit of media and PR work, and they didn't have to, but they chose to. Yeah,
it's actually a wonderful time to be around in Adelaide because you see these great, fabulous groups of cyclists everywhere. And I remember one year I was riding when I just got back into cycling, and I'd been on a long ride with a friend, and I was pretty tired, and I was going up a little hill. And a team of cyclists came up, and one guy put his hand on my back and pushed me up. It was hilarious. Anyway, so cycling, you love it. And in your clinic, Podium Physio, you do a lot of work with cyclists. You work in treatment and prevention of cycling-related injuries, and you do bike fit. Can you tell us what some of the most common cycling injuries are?
Yeah, so if you look at the research and the statistics on cycling injuries, it's nowhere near as well documented as running injuries are, but still we have a bit of information. And low back pain seems to be very common. Knee pain is probably the second most prevalent injury or problem in cycling. And I certainly see a lot of people, bike riders, coming in with those issues, but I tend to see a lot of people with neck pain as well, which is kind of due to their occupational stress. We spend a lot of time in front of computers. and looking at screens, and then you combine that with a very awkward position that your neck is in when you're cycling.
Yeah.
You essentially have your neck extended 45 degrees the entire time you're on a bike. So no wonder that people have neck problems there. But saddle discomfort, very, very common. It's very tricky issue to get around, because obviously it's a fairly intimate area of the human body, and there's so many factors involved there. It might be a bike positional thing. It might be requiring a different saddle.
Yeah.
It might be adjusting where the saddle sits. It might be something that has to happen off the bike. I mean, pelvic floor physio is a emerging area of treatment, which is fairly specific and requires a fair bit of specific training.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried lots of saddles over the years, and finally I've found some that work. And the thing that surprised me is I thought, I probably need a really big, spongy, wide one, but actually what I needed was a very narrow one. It was more comfortable.
I think that's a common misunderstanding that the more plush the saddle, the better. But what you'll find is with a plush saddle, you tend to have more rubbing, and more surface area just means more skin contact and more potential areas for trouble. And so generally, what works best is a less plush saddle, but you need to have a good chamois in your bike bib shorts. Yeah,
that's the spongy bit in the bottom of your bike shorts, for anyone that doesn't know.
Yep.
What are some exercises that you would recommend that you think, I mean, obviously there's a lot, but maybe just pick one or two that you think would benefit most cyclists?
Wow, one or two.
Oh.
God, all right. I think a lot of cyclists that come in, particularly with knee pain, I'm frequently surprised at just how much they actually lack strength in their quads, hamstrings and gluteal muscles, despite the fact that they can propel themselves quite adequately on a bike. If we test them in the clinic with things like a single leg squat, or a step down from a raised step, or a single leg bridge, a lot of people really struggle with that. So those are the sort of exercises that I'm trying to get people to work on, just to build up the capacity of those muscles. So things like single leg squats, but with particular attention on the technique, so that you're doing it with good control. You're making sure the knee is moving in line with the foot, and not showing patterns of weakness or poor motor control. Single leg bridging. A lot of people get hamstring cramps early on, but that's really just an indication that your glute muscles are asleep and your hamstrings are needing to do too much. So those are probably some of my most commonly prescribed exercises. I give people crab walks, which are side stepping with elastic band around the feet, and that really helps people who've got patellofemoral joint problems, because it strengthens the muscles around the hip that sort of set up the direction of movement of the thigh as it sort of goes up and moves up and down during a squat or during a pedaling action.
So complementary exercises clearly are very important then, from the sounds of it.
Yeah, well, most people that ride a bike, they just like to ride a bike, and that's fine. But if you want to cycle at a higher level and avoid, minimise or mitigate injury, you really want to start incorporating some conditioning. A lot of cyclists just don't have the time.
It's always
don't have the
issue.
inclination. But if you can fit a couple of short sessions into your week with some of these exercises, it only has to take 15 or 20 minutes. You can do a lot of it with body weight only. I think you're better off having some resistance equipment like barbells and dumbbells or kettlebells. But you can do a fair bit with body weight only. It doesn't have to take a long time, but it's got to be done consistently.
Yeah, and I guess correctly in terms of the motions and things.
Good technique, yeah.
So if we move on then to bike fit, can you tell us why bike fit is important in reducing the likelihood of injury?
I think when most people buy a bike brand new, they'll have some kind of at least frame size fitting from the bike shop, and you'll get some degree of actual bike setup according to your your body measurements. But the difference between what happens in a shop is you'll generally get fit to a formula. Which is fine because I use a basic formula as a starting point as well. But what that doesn't account for is, do you have any pre-existing injuries? Do you have any ongoing sort of weak areas? Often if your body is out of proportion, if you've got, it sounds a bit weird, but if you've got slightly longer arms or shorter arms, or a long torso or a short torso. If you've got any stiffness around the hips or issues with the way that you walk. So if you walk, for example, with your feet out toeing 15, 20 degrees, but you've got your pedals set up so your feet are pointing straight ahead, you've got a mismatch there. So you've got to take all of that stuff into account. And I guess as a physio coming into the bike fitting area, what I predominantly do is work with people that have got pain or injuries because either they're lacking conditioning or they've made some training errors, or the bike fit that they've got initially just didn't serve their needs. And I guess the other category is people that have bought bikes second-hand, and they just think, oh, well, that's round about the right size, and we'll worry about it.
That's me, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
for my TT bike.
You're not the only one. You save a lot of money buying a bike second-hand, but you don't necessarily get the bike that's the correct size. And it's fairly unlikely that you're going to get the bike set up for you exactly as you need. So that's when a bike fit can be particularly useful.
And Adrian, how did you qualify to be able to do bike fits?
Well, there's no rules about who can and can't do a bike fit. When I first started doing it, I didn't have a lot of particular qualifications or experience, but I had 20 years of physiotherapy background and a clinical reasoning mindset. But since then, I've done a course with Damien Oldmeadow, who's based in Perth, who's been bike fitting for a long time. He's a very well-known physiotherapist and bike fitter over in Perth. I've done further study with Paul Vicentini in Melbourne, and I actually went to Germany. Where was it? Where was it in Germany? Munster. I went to
there's a university there, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a university town. I went to this bike. They didn't call it bike fitting. It was like cycling optimisation course at the end of 2018, and that was pretty spectacular because they had the creme de la creme of bike fitting and a lot of technology companies. The stuff that's available out there if you go hunting, quite incredible. But this was a 4-day course over a weekend late in 2018, so we came back with a lot of good information and resources after that.
That's why I asked the question, because I thought it's extraordinary that even exists, a 4-day conference all about bike fitting. It's amazing. It just shows how nuanced it can be, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And what are, just pick a couple of the common adjustments you might make to somebody's bike? What are the things that people often get a bit wrong?
Well, there are so many things that you can change on a bike, from the pedals right through to the handlebars. I guess I have there's a certain number of things that I can change easily, like the angle of the stem, the height of the handlebars by changing the spaces on the top of the steerer tube, the saddle height and the saddle position. And the settings of the cleats. These are the things that we can change easily without needing any extra equipment. If you've got someone who's just really out of whack and things are clearly, the bike's the wrong size or the components on the bike are just not appropriate, then we've got to start directing people towards some additional purchases, and we might need to get a different stem or different type of cleats, or sometimes we're accommodating leg length discrepancies and you need to put
I see
shims or spaces around the cleats to lengthen the leg.
Have you ever said to someone, you just need to get a new bike, mate? It's all wrong, or not really?
I do make that comment occasionally, but you've got to be a little bit sensitive to someone's how they feel about the bike and the way it came to be in their life. If it's their dream bike, or sometimes also there might be some sensitivity in relation to the person that sold them the bike. They've put a lot of trust and faith in a bike shop or a friend who's handed a bike down, and you can't just go charging in and tell them that bike's rubbish or it doesn't fit.
Not,
but I approach that with sensitivity.
Yeah, that sounds very wise. And Adrian, because you're a physio and this is a wellbeing podcast, I'd like to have a little chat about the link between movement and well-being. So it's pretty well accepted that movement benefits physical health, and I'm just interested to hear your perspective on this. So, for example, this is a basic question, but why do you think it's important for people to move?
Because you'll die otherwise.
It's a pretty compelling reason.
Look, I think if you just put the sort of higher level cycling aside for a moment, we increasingly live in a sedentary society. The majority of us are working in front of a computer. I mean, my job's one of the few, I think, that I come across regularly where I spend equal time on my feet and equal time on a chair. But most of us, the majority of us these days, are sitting on a chair for a lot of the day, and then we drive home and then we sit on the couch.
Yeah.
So if you don't engineer some movement into your day, then you're going to suffer. And I think that I probably wouldn't call it just movement. I'd call it physical activity. I think it is such an important part of physical health, and the research these days is really pointing so strongly towards physical activity being important for mental health.
Yes, it is.
In my little clinic, I'm amazed at just how much time I spend counselling people in relation to other contributing factors to their injuries, not just the physical side.
Yeah.
But we need to keep moving. We need to keep physically healthy, and if we don't maintain those habits, we're going to succumb to the screens. And you just have to look at how teenagers spend their time. I've got a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old, and the countless hours they spend just lying on bed or sitting on the couch staring at one or two or three screens simultaneously is horrendous.
I've the same issue with mine. As much as we try and prevent it, it just, you can't be across everything all the time. Yeah. In terms of movement or physical activity and cycling, what is it about cycling specifically that's a beneficial form of movement?
Well, I think just harking back to how I got into cycling, one of the things where I made a conscious decision was I used to enjoy running. That was part of my track and field background, but I just used to start to get sore. I get sore Achilles tendons and sore knees, and I realised that trying to keep up that running habit was just going to be difficult for me. So that was one of the reasons why I transitioned to cycling. But cycling's a non-impact sport. It's non-weight bearing, which has its issues, because if you only cycle and that's the only type of activity that you get, you really need to think about supplementing that training with some other kind of weight bearing activity, whether that is walking or weightlifting is another way to do it. So you've got to get some loading through your bones. But coming back to cycling, it's a sport, or it's an activity where you can enjoy it at any age. I'm riding with guys, that are regularly out there in their 60s, in their 70s, and I know that there are other cyclists out there in their 80s and beyond. And as long as you're confident being able to control the bike, and if you can deal with the potential dangers on the road, it's an activity that you can continue with throughout the whole lifespan.
Yeah, that is one thing I really love about it too, I must admit. When I ride on Saturdays with the Lakers Triathlon Club, the variation in age of everyone out there, it's just fantastic. It's such a a fun and interesting way to spend time. You know, you're spending time with people that you may not otherwise come across because they're, 20 years older or 20 years younger than you. So it's terrific.
There's a great social aspect to the sport as well.
It's fun. It is, isn't it? With the coffee afterwards. And when you're going on a long ride, that does actually help because you kind of, I certainly look forward to the coffee at the end.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
Fantasizing about what I can eat.
That's true. Yeah, a lot of cyclists enjoy a bit of indulgence afterwards, and I must admit that I can be a little bit loose with my diet because I cycle so much. And I've got a large energy expenditure, so that affords me a large energy intake. Yeah, well, that's a definite bonus. And talking about long rides, Adrian, how would you feel yourself on a long ride? I guess depends what time of day it is. If it's early in the morning, depends how long the ride is as well. I guess anything up to 2 hours, I'd probably go without any sort of pre-ride fuel. Sometimes I'll pack gels and bars or a banana. If you're looking at a 3 to 4 hour ride, then I'll definitely be packing gels and bars and bananas. But I don't think I've got any specific diet tips there. I mean, I was just interested in your personal take on it. Yeah, I mean, I normally have cereal for breakfast, and that's what I would do on a morning if I was going for a longer ride. Occasionally we stop midway, and we might enjoy a little cake or a Danish or something like that, just to get some extra carbs in. Look, there's a lot of information out there, probably from people that are more experienced than myself, but my approach to that's always been keep it fairly simple. Yeah, and I think it's also quite personal, like in terms of trial and error, and what you can stomach while you're out there riding. Because some people, for example, really like gels, and some people don't. So, if you are on a long ride, say 3 or 4 hours, do you eat to a schedule, or do you just sort of think, I feel a bit hungry now, I'll have a gel or a banana? Or if I was doing one of these sort of, I shouldn't call them races, but these participation rides where you are sort of competing against the people around you, then they've usually got refueling stops along the way, and I think the key there is to make sure you do stop, get some fruitcake or bananas or whatever that's available to you, and whack a few in your pocket just in case it is too far to the next stop. So I definitely, if we're pushing hard, I would definitely make sure that I'm refueling at least every 45 minutes to an hour. If it's more of a social ride, and typically on a Sunday we go out with a group, and you go up a big hill, then you wait for everyone, and then you go a bit further and go up another big hill and you wait for everyone. You've got a little bit more rest and recovery there, and it's possibly not quite as vigorous. So I'd be a bit more relaxed about the intake. Yeah. The reason I ask that is if I go on if I run in something like the Eurobilla, which means I'm out there for 7 or 8 hours, I have to really do it, take the gels or whatever I'm having on a schedule. Well, that's quite extreme. But I've actually had the unpleasant experience where I probably indulged in gels, and I drank too much water on one of the Le Tap rides that I did. I think it was the first one in 2016. And I was borderline on having gastric distress at the end of it. And I didn't really understand what was happening to me at the time, but looking back, I think over that 6 or 7 hour ride, I probably had about 15 gels and I don't know how many litres of water, but I probably had too much, and I felt very queasy and unwell after that ride. Yeah, it certainly is trial and error, isn't it, in terms of finding what works for you and how often you need to have the gels or whatever you're having. So it's probably time to wrap this up. I could speak to you all day because I find this so interesting. But the final question I like to ask all my guests is, if you could recommend 2 things that all people could do to improve their well-being, what would they be? They don't have to be cycling related. They could be related to anything. Yeah, I think one of the most universal bits of advice I'd give for a better lifestyle is get to sleep early.
Yeah, that one comes up often.
I've always been a bit of a night owl, and I just cannot do that anymore with a 5 o'clock alarm to get up and go out on a bike ride. So I've changed my habits from perhaps being up till 10 or 11 at night, and if I'm still awake at 10 o'clock these days, it's going to be a rarity. And that's just the way it is. And I think if you are a cyclist and you're regularly getting up at 5 o'clock, you need to think about when you're going to bed and how you're winding down, because you need sleep. It's one of these really emerging areas of research where we're seeing that sleep deprivation and lack of quality sleep is affecting people and contributing to all sorts of illnesses and ailments, not just musculoskeletal things, but all sorts of diseases. And I guess the other, I don't know if I'd call it advice, but one recommendation that I've made to a lot of people over the years is to get involved in yoga. I think yoga is a fantastic activity. It's fairly cheap. It's easily accessible. You can practice it at home. You don't need a lot of equipment. And it's a really good example of a traditional practice that really serves us well.
Yeah, and that clearly complements cycling well too.
Yeah, cyclists get very stiff because it's a very repetitive activity in a very fixed position, and yoga takes you out of those positions and gives you the opportunity to avoid those restrictions and joint tightnesses and muscle shortening. So it's another area where cyclists fall down. They just ride the bike, and then they ride the bike a bit more. But if you're not trying to correct some of those postural issues, then eventually you'll get to the point where you can't get out of that position.
That wouldn't be a very easy position to be stuck in, would it?
No.
Bent over. And Adrian, if people want to follow you or find your practice, what's the best way to do that?
The practice is currently based in St. Peter's on Paynham Road. My website is www.podiumphysio.com.au. I've got a business Facebook page. If you looked up Podium Physio on Facebook, you'd find it there. I've got a blog on my website, which I try and update regularly. I've just actually added something this morning.
Oh, what was that about?
Well, I have a little project where I've been constructing a homemade bicycle stand. And after 2 years of experimenting with it, I've actually put it up on a few different places for sale. So
cool.
I'm looking at whether I can actually commercialise this. So I've taken a hardware shop sawhorse, and I've made some additions to it, and it's basically a cheap and cheerful version of a bike stand instead of paying $100, $150, $200 for something off the internet.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. I'll put links to all of that in the show notes. So thank you very much, Adrian.
Welcome.
And that was Adrian Barei chatting about all things cycling. I've had a bike fit with Adrian on my time trial bike, and I can thoroughly recommend it. Because Adrian is a physiotherapist as well as a bike fit expert, he brings all those skills into the fit room, and he was able to take, for example, my sore back into account. So it was really worth it. And as I mentioned, I will put links to his practice and everything in the show notes. So thank you for tuning in. You can subscribe to my podcast, Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast, on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button, and while you're there, click on the bell to be alerted when new episodes are available. You can also subscribe on your favourite podcast app, iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, Spotify or Google Podcasts, and you can follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Direct links to all social media can be found on the subscribe page of my website at www.amandaswellbeingpodcast.com. If you would like to contact me, you can send me a message via the contacts page on my website, and please feel free to suggest topics you'd like to learn more about, and I'll do my best to deliver that to you. Finally, please take a minute to leave a rating on iTunes. It improves visibility and will inspire me to keep researching for my 5-Minute Food Facts series and to invite excellent guests on to chat with. So thank you very much for tuning in. Eat well, move well, think well.